Hello all, back for another Sunday sketching session, and I thought after reading a lot of the comments and requests that I would talk a little bit about proportion today. So just a little quick summary of the way that I approach that. So whenever you want to draw something that's original from your imagination, what I usually default to is drawing the things that I know about first. So what I mean by that is that I know, let's say I'm going to do a vehicle that has wheels, right? I'm going to first establish the wheel size, the wheel base, and in this case, let's say this is the rear. I'll make the wheel there a little bit bigger. Okay, so I may start every sketch that I do when I'm first investigating a new vehicle shape by establishing the wheelbase and the wheel size. And it's really the easiest, I think, to start when you're doing a wheeled vehicle, to start with side view. Now, if you want to do something original, what I like to do is start with packaging. And so what I mean by that is start with where do the people go, where do the objects, is there cargo, what's the vehicle type. So if it's a truck, the cargo area may be very large, and the cab might be smaller relative to the wheel size. If it's a small car, let's just do a couple little quick thumbnails up here. So I'll show you the difference here and why proportion matters. Let's draw the same wheelbase. Let's do that twice. So 1, 2, 3. Okay, so roughly the same. All right, now if I want to draw a small vehicle, I want to increase the height and the door size and the window size, and that's going to make it look like a small vehicle with tiny wheels. So watch, we'll just say, okay, well, it's 2.5, even maybe even 3 tall. And let's do a little simple silhouette. I'm going to drop a little shadow on the ground, maybe see the far side rear wheel, far side wheel here. Okay, so if I do that, it hints that it looks like it's a small vehicle. It could be huge if it was some sort of sci-fi vehicle, but in our modern day world, this feels kind of small. And to emphasize that, if I add a door cut that takes up most of the side body, it's going to look even smaller. Because anytime you draw something in any sort of vehicle that we can relate to as humans, like windows and doors, then it helps us to identify and figure out the size of the vehicle. Over here, we're on the same wheelbase, same wheel size. Let's play with drawing something much bigger. And so I'm just going to draw a quick silhouette of a sci-fi truck shape. Okay, and maybe something like this. Cast shadow. And as soon as I go and do a similar sort of thing, which is just put in windows and a door, our perception of the size of that vehicle changes. Same size wheels, same wheelbase, right? But a person in relation to this door might be, something like this tall, right? Of course, if you add the figure, it makes it even easier for us to relate to it. And over here, the figure might be, something like, that tall. And so, of course, you can just add a figure in the silhouette, but if you don't want to, right, keep in mind you can play with wheel size. Really, it comes down to playing with proportions. So, and the reason I bring this up is that I see lots and lots of work online, and what I think I can recommend, probably the number one most helpful thing would be to spend more time on proportions before worrying about any value shading, before you're worrying about, oh, what is my, what's the design language of the surfacing, what are the vent shapes, what are the details, right? What's the surfacing? What are the design lines, and what's the language of those, and how do those relate to each other? Honestly, if you don't have the proportions nailed and you've made something interesting, it's not really going to matter what you do with all the rest of that. That classically is what we call polishing a turd, because there's just no way you're going to save it, and it's going to be fraught with, sort of ugliness throughout its life. So another thought on spending more time on proportions is that this works great when you're trying to invent something, we've never seen before. So I can easily just start making shapes, right? Trying to relate those shapes and giving sort of attitude and interest to the design based on the proportions of these shapes and their relationship to each other. But really, until I drop a window and a door on this, or I put a silhouette, of a person, you have no idea really what kind of vehicle this is and how big it might be. So if I just did that, right, and there was my vehicle shape, right, and I'll say, oh, well, there's the person, here's the, I'll hint at a little door here, and you can see it's a huge vehicle, so maybe there's even a ladder to get up there. So that is a completely different exercise, even though they might be like these, right? It could be the same silhouette. So scale and proportion are huge, and then of course we have a different opinion. If our person is like this, then I could effectively turn that into a skateboard, right, or something, depending if I make the person larger and larger. So for me, it's always about playing with the things that I already know, and the relationship of those things to each other. So again, if I start with a wheel and do 3 in the middle, establish the wheelbase. Now it's the next shapes that I draw that set the direction and the interest. So a lot of times you can just start with a silhouette. So what I like to do if I'm drawing something that I'm trying to invent is I like to think deeper into the packaging. So I might spend more time, I definitely will spend more time setting up some guidelines and say, well, I don't want it to be a sports car. Really, this is my height limit. I want it to have, let's say, an accent towards the back of center. So maybe there's the height of the roof. I want it to have a long hood. I want it to have a little bit more overhang in front than in the back. And then what I start to do is I sketch, right, within these limitations. Maybe a little shadow on the ground. And then another thing you can do, let's say if it's looking too tall because you set this limit, right, but you have to get there in order to put a person inside, one of the ways to make it look lower is to pull a design line in from the silhouette. So if this roof here had crown on it, a little more across the front windscreen and a little less across the top, we would see a door cut that looks like that. And so here we see less crown, here we see more. But effectively, by adding the corners, I'm reducing the height of the vehicle. It's just like the real ground clearance and the real height of the car might be in here somewhere. Right, so there's a couple little tricks. One way I always want to make them look lower if it's supposed to be something sporty. One way you can do that is cheat the shadow under the vehicle. So you add the shadow this way, and then you flatten off the tires a little bit. Don't go too far with that, because what I see a lot online is I see a lot of sketches where there's maybe an interesting super fast silhouette like this. And then there's this indication of wheels, and I'm exaggerating here. And then the bottom of the car is drawn in through here somewhere. Let's not exaggerate that much, but people will draw just like the top half of a wheel, right? And then let all this sort of fade in. So the wheels are, one, way too big. If we drew the rest of the wheel, right, it would be that big. And if I completed the wheel, then there's the ground clearance of my sports car. So be careful of that. So you can abstract to a point, but don't abstract to the point where if your viewer finishes the drawing for you, meaning finishing out the rest of the wheel, and it moves the ground this far away from the bottom of the vehicle, right, it's never really going to look anything like that when you go build a 3D model or you do more refined drawings. So I think that there's a certain level of abstraction that's okay, but don't go too far to the point where it becomes essentially such a caricature that you're basically wasting time, because you're not really dealing with the true proportions and how they relate to each other. You're faking it, and you're basically lying to yourself, to be honest, because you haven't actually started to solve any of the problems. And the big fear is that you'll find some proportion here that you love, right? And then when you make the wheels tiny in order to get the ground clearance you want, right, the proportion that you fell in love with, right, may no longer exist. So what you did is you set up challenges for yourself to translate from the super loose into the reality. So I like to try and set a few more parameters early on so that I'm problem solving the real things that I'll have to package later. I'm just not going to be able to get out of it, right? So that's one bit of advice I can give is the more I problem solve with the real things, the easier it becomes to translate into a finished model. The more I abstract, the tougher it gets. And also, if you're just using abstraction as a way to discover new forms and lines and interesting relationships of shapes, then I would recommend going more abstract. I wouldn't try to put the abstraction onto something that you know you're going to have to package and get proper wheelbase and size, etc. So I would suggest separate the two. Go super abstract, or bring it back a little bit so you're actually solving problems in your initial sketches. One of the things, if you want to draw something that already exists, you really have to know the anatomy. And I'll probably get it wrong here because I haven't drawn one in a long time, several years. But a motorcycle, I think it's about a wheel and a half, I think, between. I think the saddle is, right, I think it's somewhere in there. I think the handlebars are behind here and up about a wheel and a half as well. And again, it would depend on what sort of bike you're trying to design. There's an indication of a headlight. Maybe we see a little spring here for the suspension. I think that was up about in the middle. So if you want to draw something that is recognizable and familiar, let's see, right behind the center would be the fork rake to connect that to the head tube. A little offset to grab the axle. So if you want to make things real, you need to learn the anatomy of them first. So what I mean by that is that the more recognizable you want it to be, the more true you need to be to the real world proportions as you're drawing. If you're doing something for sci-fi, right, and it's a totally made up vehicle, like that little sci-fi truck, then what you need to default to are the cues that help people to understand the scale. And that usually, in the case of a wheeled vehicle, comes down to doors and windows. So if I do start out with a door and a window like this, Draw a little cab on here. Maybe it's disconnected from the back. It's got a big cargo box on the back of it. And maybe to make it a bit more hot rod-esque, I want some rake to the side body. Leave the rear wheels exposed by some central mechanism here. Just drop that into shadow. So this, for me right here, I usually even put a little head. This I made it totally black, but a lot of times I'll draw a little driver in there or a console, an IP there with a steering wheel, right? So that's super helpful to indicate scale. But I would recommend spending more time establishing your proportions before worrying about the language of the thing, the details, the surfacing, the styling of all the rest of that. Get the proportions right first. Get something you like, right? And the drawings don't take long to do, so just, draw it again. Practice won't hurt. And you can indicate a few little details here and there. But ultimately, I'll do maybe a page of these. The more you start to learn about the overall proportion and what works and what doesn't work, right, you can start to hone in on a stronger design before you start switching to perspective. And honestly, I don't think you need to switch to perspective at this point. And there's so much to do in any elevation or side view, even plan view. If I'm trying to come up with a new, a jet or something, what do I want it to look like in top view? Maybe that's where I start. It's always tough doing symmetry, especially when I can't put my head right over it without blocking the camera. So, excuses. So maybe start playing with the proportion of the wings. Maybe there's a double tail, maybe some sort of engine area at the back. So just worrying about the overall proportions. Now I'm starting to put in some little cut lines and details, trying to make them all relate. So do I like that proportion of the length of the nose to the wings? And then you can start, and if you want, then you could take this down into side view, right, and start to plot out, oh, I see there's the high point, there's the canopy. I want to sort of stay with that diamond shape a little bit. Whereas the wingtip's going to be out, and maybe they drop down. And there's the end, there's the front, and it goes back up into here somewhere, and it goes up to there. So you get the idea. So you start, and then we don't know what this looks like. This is all new from here down because we haven't seen any of that. We don't get any of that out of the top view, and then maybe I want to extend this back up high, and then it drops down. What about triangles? That's the end. There's the front. And maybe something a little bit below as well. Anyway, so playing around with proportions, and I can see that these proportions, as compared to this, I might like this. I might say, yeah, I kind of like what's going on there. But then when I take it into here and I try to work up the proportions in side view, I might say, ugh, that tail's way too big. I like where the length that it was here in top view, that's all we're getting out of it is the length. So I could do this, I could just chop it off with a stubby kind of tail like that. And like, oh yeah, that's better. Okay, well, now that I see this, I don't really like that, so maybe I need to chop that off as well. Maybe I want this to be more round. I want to change the balance of this to this. So I think it's worthwhile to spend a lot of time getting the balance right. If I took this truck, I might come back to this now with fresh eyes and say, oh, I'd like to just kick this up a little bit. This feels a little thin, right, compared to the balance of the cab feels a little bit heavy. I'm just going to raise up the middle part and try to change the silhouette. Do something like that. And I might say, oh, now it looks too tall. Well, it's all right, just draw it again. So spend time, get the proportions right. The thing I was starting to say about this motorcycle thing was that if you want it to look more real, you need to learn the anatomy of something first. If you want to go sci-fi, once you really know the anatomy, you can start to rearrange all those elements to make something more original. Hope that helps. Have a great week. Bye-bye.